Without further ado, please welcome FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler.
Meredith,
Great
to be here.
Go get him.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. You know, it's great to be here, to be back at CTIA, standing in front of this group at this point in time. It's hard not to think back to the first time I stood here in 1992. You know, Glenn just had a great presentation talking about what this industry has done and how far you have come in terms of serving consumers. But let me just take a different kind of walk down memory lane and take a look back at my first days here at CTIA and how that kind of gives us a useful perspective on today. Shortly after I arrived, we celebrated reaching a momentous milestone, 10 million subscribers. Now, I had an event to celebrate this with the symbolic 10 millionth subscriber, who by some strange coincidence just happened to live in the congressional district of the chairman of the House Telecom Subcommittee. She was a large animal veterinarian, and we had a lunch at that celebration at which she told me a story about how a couple of weeks before, she had been in the field tending an injured animal when her phone rang, and it was a farmer a couple of farms over calling about a heifer with a breached calf. Now think about that. A relatively short time ago, that was everybody's idea of a whiz-bang dog and pony show. Now look around us. We've gone from celebrating 10 million mobile subscribers to having more people around the world connected to the mobile network than to the electric grid. Or my favorite statistic, more people with mobile phones than toothbrushes. Not good if you're a dentist. Back then, being able to call a specialist outside the office was a killer app for healthcare. Today, sensors can monitor our vitals in real time and notify a doctor if something is wrong. And Glenn's vision of the future even goes beyond that. That is what living history looks like. In this industry is that living history. This industry has connected hundreds of millions of Americans, transformed the economy, and transformed how those hundreds of millions of people live their lives. But you've done something even more significant and more profound. Thanks to the people in this room and those who came before you. For the first time in history, the relationship between networks and those who use the networks has changed. Until mobile communications, it was the network that was in charge. commanding the user to come to the network. You could only enjoy the network on its terms. And those terms shape the patterns of economic activity and everyday life. But over the past 30-plus years, this industry has gradually created a new network paradigm, where network usage is no longer network dictated. Instead of having the user come to the network has come to the user. And that user now has an ever more powerful smartphone computer in her hand, giving her the power to consume, but perhaps even more importantly, to create information like never before. This new paradigm has already unleashed significant new productivity, transformed the role of the media, and put us on the path to the most important network-driven transformation in the history of the human experience. When I stood on this stage years ago, I was constantly saying, "You ain't seen nothing yet." Well, pardon me for being repetitive, because here comes 5G. 5G is like the missing piece of the puzzle depicting the wireless future, where today, wired and wireless networks force consumers to choose either high speed and capacity or mobility. 5G's promise of gigabit mobile connections at any location will open up hugely disruptive new value propositions for the users of networks. So think about it. In the 21st century, we have already built the most powerful engine of innovation that the world has ever known. The investment of hundreds of billions to deploy almost ubiquitous wireless networks. I noted Glenn's comment, more has been invested in this country than in any country of the world. That has created an environment in which connectivity can come from anyone, anywhere, anytime. Now, virtually unlimited fiber capacity to millions of fixed locations removes bandwidth as a constraint on innovation in many labs and businesses. And thanks to the internet's open design, protected by FCC rules, U.S. entrepreneurs can offer their ideas on this platform without having to ask anyone's permission. We've seen the deployment of massive storage and computing capacity in the cloud, the accumulation of trillions and trillions of bytes of digital information about pretty much all areas of economic activity, and the sale of 1 billion smartphones, each with more computing capacity than those powerful computers that used to be locked up in rooms and tended by a special priesthood. But what's still missing? What's the biggest remaining constraint on that vision of the wireless future that we always used to stand on this stage and talk about? It's ultra-high speed, high capacity, low latency, secure mobile connectivity. And as you all know, that's what 5G is going to deliver. as this industry proved when it removed the network limitation of having to be in a fixed place. Removing network limitations opens up exciting new uses. And now the limitations of speed, capacity, and latency are about to become history. So let me add my voice, the Commission's voice, to what you heard Glenn, and I'm sure you'll hear others discuss throughout this. You heard Meredith talk about it too, throughout this whole convention. And that is, what do we need to do to seize on that opportunity, on the opportunity represented by 5G? The answer, of course, starts with competition. With 4 nationwide carriers, the U.S. wireless industry continues to invest in faster, better networks. $33 billion invested last year, nearly $100 billion over the last 3 years, and that's above and beyond the investment in spectrum. New services and applications are constantly being introduced, and consumer demand seems insatiable. Wireless data use more than doubled from 2014 to 2015, and that trajectory is predicted to continue into the foreseeable future. So our focus must be on continuing to promote and protect a competitive marketplace. History suggests, history does more than suggest, history confirms that major technological changes such as the 5G transition bring disruption to industry structures by bringing in new entrants, capitalizing on previously unavailable value propositions. But continued vigilance is required to ensure that there is no diminution in competition as the result of new technological or marketplace development. And history has also given us an example here that this industry was a leader in. And that example is that a light touch regulatory approach is embodied in Section 332, which this industry and this association championed as a radical reform in 1993, has been proven to be conducive to innovation and investment. We should forbear from rules like rate regulation that don't make sense for the kind of services that are offered, while preserving the right to throw the flag, if needed, to protect consumers. It's an approach that's worked for over 20 years for your industry and is the model for our new open internet rules. But let's move from the more high level to the more 5G specific strategies that we can work on together. There are 3 keys for what the Commission can do to help unlock the 5G opportunity. 1, Meredith has already talked about, ensuring ample availability of spectrum to a range of competitors. 2, taking all steps to foster competitive provision of infrastructure. And 3, removing unnecessary hurdles to siting. In all of these areas, the FCC has activities underway. Yet, let's be realistic. There's more to be done if 5G is to realize its promise. On spectrum, the FCC has opened the door to the spectrum trifecta. We've targeted low-band, mid-band, and high-band airwaves that make available unprecedented amounts of spectrum. After years of work, we are finally in the midst of the historic incentive auction to make available greenfield, low-band spectrum. For as long as I can recall, this industry has had a constant refrain that government should make available more spectrum. The Congress responded to that request, and the FCC implemented a plan to do just that. We created a market that made available 126 megahertz of prime beachfront spectrum at 600 megahertz. And as you know, that market closed when the cost to clear that amount of broadcast spectrum exceeded the bid prices of the carriers. We will resume bidding next week, a new reverse auction to determine the cost to clear a reduced amount down to 114 megahertz of spectrum. And following that, we will again turn to the forward auction to determine if that spectrum is worth that price to you. But the incentive auction is just a part of the spectrum trifecta. The Commission's record-setting AWS-3 auction and the creation of new citizens broadband radio service in the 3.5 gigahertz band are landmarks to using new sharing tools to open up more mid-band spectrum. And it's particularly interesting that it is apparently in these bands, the 3.5 mid-band, where Europe sees its 5G developing. And of course, this summer, the FCC approved an order making the US the first country in the world to open up high-band spectrum for 5G networks and applications. And in order to give this industry the opportunity to lead the world in 5G, we did it in record time. Only 9 months from proposal to final decision. And folks, when you're talking about government, that's light speed. In all of these allocations, the Commission sticks to a proven formula. Lead the world in spectrum availability, encourage and protect innovation-driving competition, and stay out of the way of technical development and the details of implementation. We're also going to keep the pedal down on making more high-band spectrum available for 5G. And while we're busy putting out new spectrum, we will facilitate experimentation and innovation by soon launching our electronic filing system to accept applications for program experimental licenses. Experimental licensing has led to countless wireless innovation through the generations of wireless technologies. The new program licenses will provide much greater flexibility for researchers, universities, OEMs, and other innovators to conduct experiments and field tests of 5G technologies at scale. So that's the spectrum issue. That's one, spectrum. What about number two? Infrastructure, and specifically backhaul. Regardless of the spectrum allocation, 5G will require a lot more cells, particularly at the higher frequencies. And these small cell sites will need to be connected, so we'll need a lot more backhaul. In many areas, competition in the supply of backhaul remains limited. And that can translate into higher costs for wireless networks, higher prices for consumer, and an adverse impact on competition. I remember back when I was at CTIA, members were constantly telling me that we need to do something about special access. The kind of dedicated lines that wireless providers need to connect antennas to their networks. But the reality of trade association politics kept that from happening. Action on this issue is a long time coming, but that time has arrived. And before the end of this year, the Commission will take up a reform proposal supported by all the nation's major wireless carriers, save one, that will tackle this issue and encourage innovation and investment in what we now call business data services, while ensuring that a lack of competition in some places cannot be used to hold 5G hostage. There must be fair backhaul prices and availability if we are to connect these small cells. And the issue of the expanded number of cells brings us to the third 5G challenge, siting. How many more small cells are we going to take? Estimates are a 10x growth, potentially significantly more. That's hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of new antennas. That's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of siting decisions, which raises quite a few questions. What can the government do to accelerate investment in building out small cells? How can federal, state, and local government work effectively with the private sector? Or, to take it down to real brass tacks, how can we work with siting authorities to allow the plethora of antennas that we were required quickly and at reasonable costs? Two things in that regard. One, we need to tell the story of what 5G is, and not just in terms of technology, but as deliverables that mean something to real people. We will be unsuccessful in dealing with NIMBYism and the recalcitrance of local authorities if all we talk about is engineering. We may all love the fabulous engineering that's in 5G, but if we want the technology to be successfully deployed, we will need to talk about its benefits to people and their communities. We have to help leaders at the local level, and at all levels for that matter, understand that 5G will make the Internet of Things real. But even talking about the IoT is too obtuse. Let's talk about the benefits of smart city energy grids, safer transportation networks, and new opportunities to improve healthcare. That's why I'm excited at what Meredith told me is out on the floor, where you're focusing on these kinds of messages. Let's paint the picture of how 5G will unleash immersive education and entertainment industries, and how 5G will unlock new ways for local employers to grow, whether it's a small specialty shop or a large factory, creating new jobs and improving services to the community. 5G is not a technology, it is a revolution. It is also necessary to explain that the nature of 5G doesn't just mean more antenna sites, but it also means that without such sites, the benefits of 5G may be sharply diminished. In the pre-5G world, fending off sites from the immediate neighborhood didn't necessarily mean sacrificing the advantages of obtaining service from a distant cell site. But with the anticipated 5G architecture, that would appear to be less feasible, perhaps much less feasible. Furthermore, the nature of the technology makes the review and approval of community siting authorities and the associated costs and fees all the more critical. There are just over 200,000 cell sites in the US, but there may be millions of cell sites in the 5G future. If siting for a small cell takes as long and costs as much as siting for a cell tower, few communities will ever have the benefits of 5G. We recognize that this is a major concern, And we are committed to working to lessen these burdens and costs to ensure that 5G is available nationwide while respecting the vital role played by the communities themselves in the siting process. So that's one challenge we face together. We also need to think creatively about smart solutions to the deployment of antennas necessary for 5G to benefit the public. In that regard, how do we learn from experience and get in front of this challenge? And here's again one example, thinking back to when I used to stand on this stage, that this industry did before. Back in 2001, Singular and T-Mobile undertook a joint venture called Empire. The carriers agreed to share each other's spectrum and infrastructure in 3 states, enabling each to quickly fill coverage needs while avoiding the costs of building out redundant infrastructure. The deal was dissolved when Singular purchased AT&T Wireless, but it was considered a success. Now, to be clear, I'm not endorsing shared infrastructure in every and all circumstances, and certainly not opening the door to consolidation. But I am saying that if we're talking about thousands of antennas in a city, and you've got 4 carriers, and we are serious about leading the world in 5G deployment, and our very large and spread out country, then we ought to explore creative options on how best to build that infrastructure. For our part, the Commission is committed to cutting red tape. We've streamlined our environmental and historic preservation rules. We've tightened our shot clock for siting application reviews. And these are the collection of things we have to work on together. I've cited spectrum, infrastructure, and siting as the 3 keys to 5G. Let me quickly conclude with a couple of other issues that warrant mentioning as well. Next generation networks must be secure. And the Commission is engaged with the industry to make sure that cybersecurity is addressed during the design phase for the entire 5G ecosystem, including devices. That's one issue. Another issue, privacy is a very important topic. A lot of the value of 5G will come from the exploitation of big data. So it's imperative that carriers have privacy policies that enable customers to understand and control how their personal information is being used. The bottom line is that there is a roadmap to chart our 5G future. And now is the time to make that happen. Let's lead the world in 5G deployment the way we led the world in 4G, giving US developers a home field advantage and creating the apps and services of tomorrow. Let's remember that 5G is not an international zero-sum game. The tides of 5G will lift all boats and create opportunities for individuals all across the world. Let's commit ourselves to maximizing the benefits of 5G for rural America. We can't allow the 5G future to be the sole province of urban areas. Let's never stop pushing boundaries so that 5G and the advances it will enable go beyond what we can imagine today. I have no doubt this industry will rise to this challenge, as you have time and time again. One of my favorite quotes is from John Gardner, who said that history doesn't look like history when you're living it. Well, this industry is not just living history, you're writing it. I believe we're not just about to turn the page, but rather to open a whole new chapter in the ongoing story of how communications networks, wireless communications networks, have transformed the world for the benefit of all of us. Thank you very much.